Great. And we're live. So another TADSummit preview, this time with Vish, who many of you know. He's been a big change agent in the industry for many years. On the weblog, you'll see he's been writing some very interesting articles. I think this is some seminal work that is happening here in the articles that Vish has been putting together. So I'm just going to get straight down to the questions. So Vish, you highlight the access network as commoditizing. However, this is where most of the money gets spent by telcos, either in radio access or in fiber. Is the future without action a commoditized ISP business? And there's a sort of second linked question. Who are some of the examples of telcos that are sort of getting it right in this sort of move, given the commoditization of access networks?
Yeah, absolutely. Most of the capital budgets within the service provider landscape is largely invested into infrastructure. I think what's typically not well accounted for is the labor costs. So doing open trenching for laying fibers, the civils and the construction, getting the zoning and the permitting, all of those greasing the palms kinds of activities that happen behind the scenes are actually some of the dominant pools in the cost equation for operators. And when you take a look at how that ecosystem has moved, well, Moore's law has actually favored service providers on the equipment side. You've actually seen a steady decline in the capital cost for equipment to the point where that actually isn't the number one concern. You do have new technologies like SDN and NFV that are helping to open up some of the appliance-like behavior of these infrastructures. But fundamentally, what they're delivering is a different value equation, which is going to be how can I optimize the automation of a lot of this. And so that's another part of taking the labor cost out of deploying these networks. So we are seeing that stepwise change has happened. Labor costs start to come down as you see the ecosystem take hold around tower companies and infrastructure sharing, those types of things. I think we'll see yet another step change with 5G as we move into network slicing and the infrastructure starts to become much more multi-tenant. But prior to that, if I take a look at what are some of the order magnitude shifts that are happening. And, it's really not coming from the incumbent service providers. It's actually coming from outside the traditional and orthodox service provider world. It's coming from initiatives like the Telephony Infrastructure Project with Google. It's coming with the emergence of things like WiGig, where you've got small little ISPs like Starry starting up in Boston, which is providing very, very low cost wireless local loops for broadband. And you think of what kind of cost equations they've been solving. Typically, you get a fiber rollout where the cost per home passed is somewhere around $2,000, maybe $1,500. And so you need high penetration in order to get a break even. With something like Starry, I may need 5 to 10% penetration. The cost per home pass might be somewhere around $400. So you can see that there's these dramatic swings now happening as these much more commoditized wireless access technologies that are starting to achieve these broadband speeds start to come in. So I definitely put some of these smaller players. WebPass is another one, which was just recently acquired by Google Fiber.
Yeah.
So I think these are the folks who are really pushing the envelope. Will they be able to do it at scale? Can they get the operational leverage that the big service providers get? I think those are key questions. The closest within the incumbents has got to be AT&T. AT&T has made some dramatic pushes towards virtualizing their access infrastructure. And the question is at what point are they going to get in 5 to 10 years, or will some of the more radical systems overtake them?
Yeah, because I think that is because the Google Fiber team, I think, were talking around in sort of broadband futures, whether actually wireless is the answer rather than fiber. So I think that let's face it, it's been the question facing us for 30 years, and the answer by most telcos has been to just delay fiber. Maybe the answer will be clearer. Here we are, 2016, and the answer still isn't clear, but I think you're right. We're now starting to see some very interesting companies popping up, doing that order of magnitude shift in the costs per home passed and costs per home connected as well. Because again, that's one of the great things with wireless. You know, the difference between passed and connected is pretty small. So that's some great insight there. Now, moving on to the second question. There's a lot of hype around 5G, which again is an access network. It's all about basically connecting the customer to the internet. It's internet access. It's not actually providing the internet as a service. It's just accessing the internet and then all the services that are out there on the internet. Now, should the focus with 5G actually be, and this sort of overlaps a little bit on what you were saying before, on the cost of deployment and operations, than trying to bake in particular services within the sort of 5G specs?
Yeah, I think it's got to be a little bit of both.
Okay.
5G, when you take a look at the roadmap from LTE Advanced, LTE Advanced Pro to 5G, it's leaving a lot of the folks in the industry scratching their heads as to what exactly is it going to deliver that NB-IoT doesn't deliver, that carrier aggregation doesn't deliver.
Exactly.
And it seems to really turn on this notion of can I get access to millimeter wave, and can I open up the vast reserves of spectrum that allow us to finally, be able to create those multiplier gains and throughputs. But I do think that there's, some critical opportunities that 5G will start to enable. And one of them is we've always had a problem on densification of the networks. And as capacity increases, you start to do infill, you start to do cell splits, you bring in the small cells, and all of a sudden you become interference dominated.
Yeah.
And there's certainly a lot of hope that with 5G and really rethinking how do we do cell planning, we'll actually start to open up some more degrees of freedom for how cellular providers actually deploy capacity. There's really interesting techniques that are coming out, like being able to split the data from the control, so that your control comes from a macro, data is being served by all these small cells. Some fantastic types of technologies that I think will give us some interesting capacities. But to the point of, does 5G have to be something different? And I really do think that the industry is struggling with this whole notion of how do we bring enterprises under the tent? Are we going to be the ones that define what the service looks like, or is it actually going to be enterprises who take wholesale slices of the network? And how do you create that autonomy of the enterprise to leverage the network? And who owns the traffic management policies? Who owns the service delivery capability and the whole cyber delivery infrastructure? In fact, who owns that? It's very different, and I think that we're staggering a little bit on trying to understand and come to terms with that as an industry. I think that there are some amazing new technologies that are giving us a hint of what in fact 5G could be, and it beyond just the capacity increases. I think 5G could be a new part of the internet delivery infrastructure, meaning that can I move away from deployment of application in clouds to the deployment of applications in infrastructure? In fact, can this new 5G infrastructure actually provide a multi-tenant hosting environment, not just in terms of compute, but also in terms of spectrum? And there's a lot of, I think, emergent thinking around that. And I question whether the 3GPP ecosystem will be able to deliver that vision in a way that's going to be manifest, for the rest of the world.
Exactly.
I think it may have to be influenced from the outside in.
And that's an excellent point, because this is something, again, in the TADSummit agenda we directly deal with. I mean, we've got a session dedicated to what we call a sort of network app store, that is putting applications and services at the edge. We also have on day 2, because you'll be providing the keynotes at the start of day 2, we have the dangerous demo, which is physically showing what's possible in putting applications within the edge of the network. And I think what you're reflecting is, there's been a broad umbrella of 5G in terms of, it's anything and everything has been thrown in there. I think taking, with your 3GPP cap on, dealing with the dense cell issue, you can see how 5G can solve that readily, and there's a clear, easy to understand business case. Once we start getting into, opening it up and allowing enterprises or other service providers to come in and start to be able to take advantage of some of the capabilities. And we're seeing, for example, that's part of the discussion we see in the Rethink project. That also will be running a session at TADSummit. Whether that, I think we're still too early in the thinking from a standards perspective, and definitely from a telco perspective. But there are people coming from the sort of website, from the cloud side. You mentioned the telephony infrastructure project. There's also, for example, the Canonical guys. They're doing some really cool work. Again, they're one of the sponsors at TADSummit, who are sort of taking their cloud view and applying it to networks. So it could be interesting. I think over the next couple of years, we really are going to see a sort of convergence between two different schools of thought. Whether it gets realized within 5G, I think that's a big question mark. However, I think a lot of the web guys almost don't want to be touching the sort of network standards. It's like, just give me the capacity as dumb as possible, and I'll do all the smarts on top of it the way I think best.
I think you've hit it on the head. I think that there's a couple of things that are playing in our favor. One is that this notion of abstracting complexity by coming up with techniques like AWS Lambda, which is the whole serverless architecture. And things like whether it's Juju from Canonical or whether it's Cloud Foundry, allowing really application deployment to be a lot more automated. I think these techniques could be applied in a mobile world where they abstract the complexity and all of the frustration of trying to discover where this hosting would happen and then being able to localize it. All that can be orchestrated in the background. And I note this acquisition, the investment that Cisco and Ericsson jointly made in this company called PubNub, which is actually one of the precursors to being able to deploy applications in the network by using almost a CDN-like infrastructure. So I think these things, to your point, are probably not going to come from 3GPP. I think they will come from the outside world, from the web world, let's call it. But I think that there's going to be some middleware that is going to have to be well-defined and thought through as we step through the 5G standards.
Exactly, and I think that's going to be where the interesting battle is. Because in taking a web model, it's just throw it out there, see what works. And evolve, given the experience from practical deployment, rather than send some basically standard engineers to think on high with limited knowledge of the real world and somehow produce magically a specification. So I think it will be the classic battle, but I feel and each operator will take a different course. And we're seeing that today. I mean, you've already made reference to AT&T and some of the work that it's doing in, not relying on, standards per se, but actually driving its own course that it thinks is best for itself. So I think we'll see some of the larger operators take a more web-centric approach, which we've been calling for years now. Well, we'll see others that are more dependent on their strategic vendors, just following the line that the standards set. And who ends up winning in that? I think only the market will decide. So moving on, because when I was reading through your articles, which are great, the industry still continues to make big investments in terms of time and money on IT transformation, on this never-ending sort of NFV, SDN, and all the continuous refinements and security issues and further management specifications. And the ROI on it is, well, it's not quick. And part of the challenge we have is it's momentum. We've always done, our next generation networks this way. We've always done our IT this way. So, it's almost like the industry is just moving business as usual, taking the same people, the same approaches, and creating vast, expensive projects that aren't enabling that much experimentation along the ideas that we've been discussing. So how can telcos break from this sort of business as usual approach?
There's no silver bullet.
No.
Is the sad part, and there's a lot of different cultural and organizational constraints, and I think those are actually the pieces that dominate. Many times you have someone who's a network engineer who's configured Cisco routers all his life, and he's got a CCIE, and maybe he's been adventurous enough to do Perl scripting or Python scripting to automate it, but for you to take them out of that mindset and say, well, we're actually going to do a step change. We're going to manage this whole thing as if it were software code. Yeah. You really start to break a lot of the DNA that's inherent in the network engineer. And I comment on this with some level of experience where I've seen a company that implemented SDN, and fantastic company. We took a look at evaluating them while I was at a service provider, and they had done, I think, a phenomenal job of leading the industry on creating an on-demand service for capacity. And the problem was that they didn't really change their operations. They left their existing operations team in place. And they didn't really try to shift them or move them in any substantial way. That was my wife walking back in the back.
Oh, don't worry. I've had contractors walking in the back during my wife walking through, kids running past, so don't worry. This is the real world,
right. So they didn't actually make the changes to exploit the architectural shift that they made. Yeah. And so as a result, their costs ballooned, and they effectively had two separate organizations and management, kind of capabilities to manage. So, I think it's a difficult thing to do this transformation. Maybe the one point that I would make is that almost every IT transformation program I've been on has been this idea that the CFO had that we're here, and then we're going to be here, and that's going to cost me less. And it's always this notion of moving from one state to another state. I think what a lot of the IT and CIOs need to really start to push back against is that this isn't a one-step change. We got to get into a mode of I'm continually changing. Yeah. And it's what Nicholas Taleb calls, the anti-fragile organization. It's what, this whole concept of agile in DevOps has really started to, scream into the telco space. And in many cases, it's still not well understood. I've seen many projects where it's an agile program to get me to this next waterfall step, right? And it's a DevOps program, but it's not really DevOps, right? We're not going to go do continuous integration or continuous deployment. We're just going to do the development part, which is really not the issue. The issue is, how do I create a heartbeat that allows me to continually change so that my cost structure continually changes?
Exactly. I think that's a very good point. And you're right, there's from agile development and applying that within a DevOps framework. I mean, this, again, since the very first TAD hack, where we did a hack of IMS in minutes, we took a DevOps approach to basically the deployment of IMS to show, look, guys, it is feasible using open source software to fire this up in minutes rather than months. And then once you have it up, then get into that, sort of continuous improvement. Again, I sort of, it reminds me of discussions we had back in the 80s when total quality management was being rolled out. But I think we now have the software tools to enable us to, as you say, remove some of the cultural element, because I think it is. You hit the nail on the head in terms of it's a big people issue for most telcos in terms of managing this.
Simon Wardley has this great analogy for how you set this up, and he rails against this term two-speed IT, which has been adopted as the vision for a lot of different telcos. And it's that you can have the people who do the pioneering work, and they're going to really work to reduce the cost of change, and they're going to use agile methods to do that. But you're going to get to a place where you have bedrock that you can't change because the cost of changing it out is too much.
Exactly.
The data is hidden in the applications. I don't have APIs for it, and I don't want to digitize that domain. And that's really where you want to reduce cost of deviation. And that's where you're going to have your Six Sigma methods. You're going to apply a different set of management principles to that. And that's almost what the two-speed ethic tells us. But what you can see is missing is, well, how do I take this agile new goodness and take it through the life cycle journey? And there's a middle part, which is really about how do I productize that thing and allow it to scale.
Exactly.
So that when it does become mission critical, it'll sit in the bedrock and I'll have people who can manage it. And you find out that you actually need 3 different pools of talent. I need, the pioneers, I need the settlers, and I need the city planners.
Exactly.
And they all have to exist. And so it's more than just, this 2-speed. I need 3 speeds. I need that piece that can take the innovation and move it to the larger part of my organization.
Exactly, and that comes back to what you were talking about earlier in terms of the sort of innovate, leverage commodity, where you do the cool stuff, you make it a platform so other people could do cool stuff on top of it, and then you basically make it a commodity so it's so damn cheap nobody else can copy you.
Exactly.
So, which is, again, it's taking that sort of web model, but I think that hits it on the head, and it's proven. We can see in the way Google operates and the way Facebook operates, how they've taken that and made literally billions out of that operation model. So let's just wrap up because we're coming up on time, and I'm sure we're going to get a lot more discussion at TADSummit. You gave some interesting hints of your upcoming LinkedIn article, previewing some of the sort of business models associated with both the short head and long tail. I was just wondering if you'd give us a hint of some of those business models to get people sort of appetite whet for when your next LinkedIn article comes out.
Yeah, I think one of the examples that's always fascinated me is what happened when servers became commoditized. And there was a steady decline within Dell and HP. And obviously we see what's happened today as Dell's privatized and HP's broken up, how that economy impacted their industry. But what probably wasn't really fully understood was as the server went from a product to a commodity, it shifted its whole business model. It went from I'm selling you a server and you're going to rack and stack to I'm actually going to buy the capacity through a cloud. And this was the Amazon model. And that radical commoditization of compute, which was actually the service that Dell and HP were selling, really started to shatter these incumbent businesses. And it gave rise to a new set of innovations. And that innovation had nothing to do with compute. It was the availability of compute. So how do I exploit the commodity compute and build higher innovations? And this was the whole developer ecosystem that started to emerge, where it came as a perfect storm for companies like Apple and Google, who really gave birth to the app ecosystem on top of mobile phones. And that trinity, if you will, is something that you could actually see in almost any point of commoditization of a valuable service or something that provides mission critical support for businesses or for consumer services. So I look at, well, is that happening inside the network infrastructure world? And certainly you do see that. Within the core of the internet, it's gone through this dramatic shift. Had this really hierarchical exercise where there was backbone providers who took all the cost but all the value, and then you had transit, and you had the production networks that connected to consumers. That doesn't exist anymore. What's happened is you've got these big cloud companies, these hyperscale giants who are direct peering, whether it's Netflix or whether it's Amazon or whomever, and the internet has become very flat. And what happened as a result is all these transit connections started to go to commodity. And then you had companies like Akamai who came in and started developing CDNs. Well, what is a CDN? It's an overlay on top of all these commodity networks. And the question is what will that look like when it happens in access? And we're already starting to see that happen in access with software-defined wide area networking players like Ariaka or VeloCloud or Viptela, for instance, who are able to overlay these access networks in order to provide first-mile access into your cloud content. So it kind of gives you the sense that, well, this commoditization is actually happening. And what are the new higher-order innovations? Is it only going to be overlay networking, which certainly I think could be interesting, but it's not going to be sexy. I think the other way of looking at it is, well, then what is a network service? Network service is a way to access my data, right? Just like how a server that was sold by HP or Dell was a way to access computing, and I bought it in lots of servers. But when you had Amazon, suddenly I could buy it on demand, and I had different means in terms of accessing that compute capability. What if I had different means of accessing bandwidth? And you marry that with an Internet of Things world, and you realize that the value, the innovation that kind of sits on top of that is about data. And to me, it starts to inform that the service provider needs to shift their model away from symmetrically charging for a connection and start to look at how do I make charging for data a little bit more interesting. And when I say data, I don't mean volumes of data. I mean, how do I model data, make it available to any app developer, and create a massive fabric that can publish that data to the apps, the machine learning engines, to anything that exists out there that needs to consume data, make it understandable and readable. And that whole process, that whole evolution could start to form a new business model for operators, not one that's associated with the connection, but one that's associated with the value of that data that's being connected. So I'm going to expand on that a lot more, but I start to think about that turning the business model, much like how the developer economics turned with the evolution of Dell to the cloud.
Exactly.
I think the evolution of the service provider capital-intensive infrastructure and charging per connection could evolve into, I'm just a big data fabric. And what I can do is publish you temperature data. I can publish you soil data. I can publish you data about the consumer. I think that there's pools of data that can be modeled and standardized and then made accessible applications who need to consume it without having to have a one-to-one relationship between the application developer and the source of the data. When those two things can be independent, suddenly this community is just going to thrive, and you'll start to get those network economics that make value today in the internet world.
Yeah, I think that's one of a number of examples that are enabled when you sort of take that sort of, I guess, on-demand approach to network services and the associated data from all the sort of services that are going over there. Now, we could go on for a long time because then we got the whole encryption issue, and it's there's a lot of stuff to be discussed there, but this is great. Again, it's just a teaser, and again, thank you, Vish, for giving your time and also for doing the keynote for day 2 on TADSummit. We're going to have, I think, with the Canonical guys, with the Project Rethink guys, we're going to have a real interesting mix of people at TADSummit that I think this is going to be a very long, into the night dinner discussion between day 1 and day 2. So again, Vish, thanks so much for your time, and I'll see you in Lisbon in a couple of months' time.
Great. Thanks, Alan.
Thanks again.